think you are one of the few person who are world expert in Hermetic philosophy and especially European Renaissance literature. So,
Yes.
for my viewers, can you introduce a little bit about yourself?
About myself. Um, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Very, very much appreciated. Yeah, okay, my name is Wouter Hanegraaff. What can I say about myself? I am working at the University of Amsterdam. I have been there since 1999. And the chair is called History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, which basically stands for a large field of study that we also refer to as Western esotericism, or simply as esotericism in Western culture. And so this covers an enormous domain, starting in antiquity, in the period of the first centuries of the Common Era, and then running through the whole of Western culture in a broad sense, up to the present. And so the way that I look at the field is I see it as, in a technical term, I call it rejected knowledge. Because all these traditions have one thing in common, and that is the fact that at least since the European scientific revolution and Enlightenment periods, they have been seen as, well, as they have been basically, well, rejected by mainstream culture, by mainstream intellectual culture, by the academy, and they were seen as superstitious, wrong, misguided, and so on and so forth. So this entire field was basically, yeah, expelled, you might say, from the academy, from academic research. And so it remained a kind of an, yeah, a domain, a kind of wastebasket category, as I sometimes call it, of everything that the modern academy is not willing to take seriously. And so in my field, and I'm not alone, of course, I have many colleagues and we have international scholarly organizations, but in our field, our conviction is that all these traditions are actually very influential, important. We have to know about them. And if you write them out of history, then you end up misperceiving a lot of essential things about what Western is about. So yeah, that is what I do. And so I've been writing, so my first book was about the New Age movement, which was really focused on the post-war European and American, you know, kind of alternative spirituality. And then I tried to place the New Age movement in a wider context of esotericism. So I wanted to see it not just as a contemporary phenomenon, but as something with deep historical roots. So that was that book. And then later on, I started exploring the Hermetic traditions more specifically. And I can say a bit more about it if you want. But the Hermetica, the Hermetic traditions, which is also in the title of my chair, History of Hermetic Philosophy. So Hermetica refers to a series of traditions, spiritual traditions, I would say, in the Roman period, Roman Egypt specifically, 2nd, 3rd century, which led to very influential and important, profound texts, the so-called Corpus Hermeticum and other Hermetic writings, which were then passed on and got translated in the Renaissance period in the 15th century into Latin, and made a big impact on intellectuals and on the wider culture. So this whole Hermetic tradition can be traced from antiquity to the present. And that's another concern of mine. So my second book was about a 15th century Hermetic philosopher, Lodovico Lazzarelli, whom I sort of discovered, I might say, and whom I think is very important and very fascinating. And so that was the topic. And then, yeah, after that, I've been doing all kinds of other things related to this field. So I've written a book, Esotericism in the Academy, which is kind of a description of how this whole field got marginalized and expelled from the academy, why that happened. And of course, it was a plea for correcting that process and bringing it back on the table. My most recent book was again about the Hermetica, so it's called Hermetic Spirituality and Historical Imagination. And this is really an attempt to go very deeply into the Hermetic literature, to really find out what these texts were all about. And I'm continuing that kind of research because I hope to write a book about the reception of the Hermetica in the Renaissance, and hopefully even a third volume about the modern and contemporary reception of the Hermetica. So this is more or less the whole field that I'm covering. It was a bit of a long answer to a short question. I hope it's okay.
Thank you. So my question is, the time when Hermetic literature was started to being compiled,
Yeah.
at the same time, like especially Greek and like they are more focused on philosophy and science, like proto science.
Right.
And at the same time, there was like a spiritual crisis between Egypt versus Middle East. Christianity was emerging. And now that we have in our modern life philosophy, science, and religion. But where is this Hermetica? What, like for a general reader, like where is the role of this Hermetic literature inside this context?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. That's really a good question. It goes directly to the heart of the whole field. The way that I would answer it is this. If we go back to antiquity, where it all started, then, like you say, we think of Greek philosophy and Greek culture. We think of it as rationality, rationalism, science, and so on. But I think that's already where the misperceptions start, because the whole Platonic tradition, to begin with, Platonism in all its forms, was not just what we see as a rational philosophy. It was much more than that. It had a very strong religious or spiritual component from the beginning. That's already in the in the Platonic literature itself. And this, let's call it the spiritual dimension of Platonism, re-emerged very strongly in the same periods when the Hermetica emerged, and these phenomena are interrelated. So this is not philosophy. It is not a rational philosophy as we understand it, even though it makes use of philosophical language. It certainly does that, but that's not what it's all about. These are not people who try to solve philosophical problems. They're also not scientists. They make use of common ideas about science, natural science in their works, but that is not their focus. Again, can we call it religious? Well, depends on what you mean by religion. If we think of religion as something collective based upon common doctrines that are shared by a whole community and so on and so forth, then perhaps these are not really religious movements, but rather spiritual movements. And by spiritual, I mean that these are traditions that are less concerned with large doctrinal halls and so on, or churches and so on and so forth, but are rather concerned with individual experiential practice. That's the term that I would use. So we are dealing with people, basically individuals, who came together in small communities, but the focus was on a personal, individual, spiritual path. And it was based upon doing things, so there was a strong ceremonial part to it, and it was based upon experiential dimensions about visions and voices and mystical experiences, if you want to call it like that. So this is what makes them specific.
The thing I was thinking when you was talking, that if somebody study science, philosophy, religion, but they don't even consider reading Hermetica or Hermetic literature, my question would be, will they miss something important?
Yes, I think they will miss something important. Because, what can I say? Let me think first of all, they miss something important because these texts are profound. These are not just superficial texts. You can see that they have an intrinsic value. They are profound, they are deep. And so they're valuable in themselves. I think it's also you'll be missing something, because simply there is so much more than only the kind of official doctrines that we hear about from rational science and philosophy and from established religions. There's much more. Normal people, individuals, are doing their own things. They're giving their own spin to the doctrines and the ideas that exist in their environment. And often often what they do with them is original, creative, different. So by studying these things, you open up a whole dimension of as I call it, experiential dimensions that we tend to overlook, and we tend to overlook them simply because the standard official mainstream religions and cultures don't pay attention to them. So we're not aware that they are there. But once we discover them and we read them, then we realize that you find things here that you do not find anywhere else. And I think that means an enrichment of our way of looking at the world. I'm not in the business of, as a scholar, I'm absolutely not in the business of advocating these kind of traditions. I'm not saying whether they are right or wrong, or whether they, I think some of them are profound, like the Hermetica, certainly, in terms of content. But my main point is not whether they are right or wrong, but simply that they are there. They are there, and we have to know about them because they have something to say that is not being said elsewhere.
Yeah, people are different. For example, some people follow their own path. Some people just follow their established religion. Some people follow scientific path. But if somebody is not particularly religious, but they think they're spiritual, but they cannot find the connection between philosophy and science, because some people are not interested in study religion. For them, I think Hermetica can bridge by remaining more philosophical and logically rigorous, yet more revelatory. So it connects the bridge between common sense, I would say. Not
I think this is a very good, I really like the way that you formulate this. I agree. Yeah.
Exactly. So this literature is important. So when I was studying, I'll tell you a little bit of my encounter, I would say, this literature. So roughly at the same time when I watched your Infinite webinar series of the Hermetic tradition, just prior to 1 to 2 years prior, I was working in my lab, and it was like an electrophysiological study for some ion channel something. So the person was a graduate student before me. He wrote a small protocol about how to do things, because those kind of thing actually doesn't exist in literature. You have to do it. You have to build your own custom design for sealing the electrical, like a Faraday cage. So he was referencing in one sentence that your electrical equipment has to be hermetically sealed.
Huh.
That because I know English very well, I claim myself, then I could not understand what he was trying to say, why he was saying hermetically sealed out of so many different way to express the same thing, like tightly sealed, bulletproof, all kinds of, why he used the hermetically sealed. Then I Googled. That gives me the floodgate that, oh my goodness,
I
this
see.
is a big literature and it's an alchemical term, and he was using alchemical term. Why? And then I realized, oh, this literature is very rich. It's hidden in plain sight, but you have to look for it. That's the difference.
That is a very nice, well, you're formulating these things so well. Hidden in plain sight. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So you have to pay attention to it, and then you see that it's there. Yes.
So let's talk. We have a small agenda. I think I shared with you. I'll go through and you just talk about those. So
Sure.
first of all, I think you also already gave us a little bit of time frame that it was around the Roman Egypt. So can you elaborate when the text of Corpus Hermetica was composed? Roughly what time frame, and any idea who compiled it and who transmitted it?
Right. Well, they were probably written in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. We do not know exactly. Some parts might be a bit earlier, but basically 2nd, 3rd century, that's it. So that means before the triumph of Christianity. So we are dealing with with pagan texts. And when I use the word pagan, I want to specify that for me, pagan has a neutral sense. It is not a negative term for saying things that are pagan are bad. Pagan simply means the kind of religious and spiritual and also philosophical currents that existed in the Hellenistic world in that period. So I use pagan in a very neutral, non-pejorative sense. So these are pagan traditions. There are very, very little influence, well, no influence really from Christianity, almost nothing from Judaism, maybe a little bit, but it's very, very marginal. So these are really almost completely pure pagan texts from Roman Egypt. We do not know who wrote them. We don't have names, they're anonymous, but the texts are attributed officially to Hermes Trismegistus. And so this is an honorary term, an honorific term, the thrice greatest Hermes. And supposedly Hermes Trismegistus was an ancient wise man who lived in, much earlier than the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. That's the fiction that is being promoted in these texts. And so you see Hermes Trismegistus engaging in dialogues with a couple of students, pupils, Thoth, Asclepius and others. And they talk about, the nature of the world, the nature of God, and the nature of human beings. They talk about questions of how do you find gnosis, Greek term that means direct spiritual ultimate knowledge, how to reach that, what needs to be done to reach that, and so on and so forth. So these are a kind of educational spiritual dialogues. And that's the Hermetic literature. So who wrote them? Nobody knows for sure. My interpretation is that these texts were circulating in very small circles of networks of practitioners who sent each other these texts to stay in contact with each other, because you don't have public transport. I mean, how do you stay in touch with each other? You can only do it by text. So they were, I think, circulating these dialogues as a kind of an ideal text about the spiritual path. They did this almost certainly in secret. It's interesting that there has been almost basically no reports by outsiders about these people. So they must have been flying below the radar. So they didn't attract attention. They met probably in their homes, maybe in deserts, in sanctuaries of temples, and probably the groups are very, very small. The names are anonymous. I assume a little bit that these, when you see the names of Hermes and Thoth and Asclepius and so on in the text, well, there must be real persons behind them. And I cannot prove this, but I assume that they took on names. So in the ceremonial context, one of them, the leader, would refer to himself as Hermes Trismegistus, to show the position of authority. And other pupils would take names that refer to Egyptian deities, Asclepius, Thoth, referring to Thoth, the Egyptian god, and so on. So yes, and for the rest, it's a mystery. We do not know who these people were. There are a few names that I connect with these circles. One of them is the alchemist Zosimos, who was working in the same period in Panopolis in Egypt, and who's this more or less the founder of alchemy. And alchemy is often seen as the Hermetic art. And so these people were working in laboratories in doing, let's say, chemical experiments and so on. And Zosimos probably was an Hermetic practitioner. I'm pretty sure of that. And another name that you can identify is the great Neoplatonic philosopher, Iamblichus. So you have Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, then you have Porphyry, his pupil, one of his pupils, and then Iamblichus was a Syrian Neoplatonist who got in touch with Porphyry and has left us a text in which he talks about the Hermetica. And I think that the evidence is very strong to assume that he was actually spent part of his life in Alexandria, in Egypt, and participated in Hermetic circles. So the names are anonymous. We do not know for sure, but at least a few well-known people like Zosimos and Iamblichus can be connected with them.
Yeah, they're very well-respected person at that time, and they're not just random farmer or random manual worker. They're like top echelon of their time, of their
Yes.
it's almost like priestly class with a dedicated profession like masonry or artillery or some smithing, like building some weapon or some foundation or some building. Like they're more like by profession what we call professionals today, like scientists or professionals. But
Yes.
in their personal life, they are more like a priest and philosopher themselves. But their writing is mostly spiritual rather than practical day-to-day problem solving, that kind of thing. So they're very
I really,
keen
let me say that I really admire your clarity. You summarize it so well. It's exactly like you said, and it's true that these people were professionals. It's important they were Egyptians, but they were writing in Greek, and Greek was the language of the higher educated classes in Egypt. So, like you say, these were people, well-educated people, and Zosimos was a craftsman who spent his time basically, who made his money, made his living by making statues for the temples. And so yes, these were skilled practitioners and professionals, as you say.
So the first reference and documented book that was compiled in the golden era of the Greek literature period. So, but that's not the beginning of the tradition for sure, because they referred themselves. It came from late, a long time ago, and
Yeah.
it was like carried by lips to ear, like an oral tradition, and master to people. Then at the when there is a like political war, all kinds of cultural shift, they compiled at the last vestige that we need to compile these, otherwise this wisdom will be lost. So
Yeah.
that was the last like round of compilation rather than the first initial compilation, right? I think those time they felt insecure that if you don't write it down, it might be permanently lost. So let's write down something.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good, fascinating point because, well, the question is how old are these traditions really? Of course, they refer back to earlier traditions. They refer to certain aspects of Egyptian religion. There are Platonic references, and of course, they tell us that all of this is very old. But to be honest, I do not know. I do not know how old it really is, because we know that the text came from the second, third centuries. Of course, all kind of ideas may have come from earlier periods, but personally, I'm not strongly inclined to think that they are much older than, let's say, the beginning of the Common Era, even though elements of them might come from there. So I think they're pretty much of that period. But it's true. This point of let's write it down to prevent it from vanishing. It's an important point. There is especially the text known as the Asclepius, probably the biggest Hermetic text, which contains a very impressive lament over the decline of Egypt. So it's very impressive. It sounds like written by an author who's deeply saddened and deeply concerned about the fact that all the ancient traditions that have lived for so many centuries in Egypt are declining, the temples are breaking down, foreigners are flooding the land, are destroying the ancient cultures, and so on and so forth. And they say that very soon, Hermes actually says, very soon there will be nobody anymore who will understand, who will still understand the true wisdom that I'm teaching you. And yes, so it has to be written down. And there is another instance where, that's another text written in Coptic, on the 8th and the 9th sphere, it's called the Octavia et Enneade, where we read a very impressive description of a ceremonial ascent of the soul to the highest spheres. It's very impressive, it's beautiful. And then when that is done, then Hermes and Thoth, the pupil, are sitting down. And again, Thoth is being instructed to write it down, or not just write it down, to carve it into stone tablets that will be placed in the temple, so that this wisdom will not get lost. And so, yes, that's a very important part of saying that this is incredibly ancient. It's under threat. It is endangered. We might be the last generation, but in a remote future, there will be a moment when people will rediscover our wisdom and maybe revive it.
Yeah, exactly. And my personal inquiry about how old this figure of Hermes, not necessarily the book we're talking about, that is second century, as the scholars have found, and you personally reviewed the literature, you know your stuff. I have full confidence, but I'm just talking about, let's speculate about legend of Hermes, like just theoretical legend, that what culture referred back to Hermes in a same name or similar name, but that person or entity must be very old. For example, I'll start, then we'll continue. For in Egypt, they referred back this Hermes figure to Thoth. So that's obviously very old. So across culture, let's talk about what Hermes represented in Greek culture. Who was the Greek Hermes, for example?
Yeah. Okay, this is another issue. You're right. Yes, of course, the Greek Hermes is the messenger of the gods, linked to scripture, for instance, to translation, all kind of other things, depicted with wings and with winged feet. The messenger who brings on messengers from the gods into human beings, the kind of God who can flit over borders that other people cannot cross, and so on, that normal people cannot cross, only gods can cross, and so on. And what happened is that when Alexander the Great occupied Egypt, so that was the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, in which Egypt was ruled by the Greeks. So during that period, the Greeks did not try to convert the Egyptians to their own beliefs, something like that. They allowed them to have their own practices, but they translated the names of the Egyptian gods into their own names. And so the god Thoth, who had similar kind of functions in ancient Egyptian religion, the scribe of the gods, the involved in the judgment of the souls after death and those kind of things. It was sufficiently, so Thoth was sufficiently similar to Hermes. And so the conclusion was that, okay, what the Egyptian called Thoth, we call Hermes, and it's basically the same god. So you get this kind of mixture, the Thoth Hermes figure. And you're right, that syncretism, or that mixture, must have emerged much earlier, during the centuries after Alexander. So this is about a couple of centuries before the Common Era.
That's fascinating. Like in the later literature, Hermes became a very minor deity. But if you inquire that how old is Hermes compared to other like Greek gods, then you'll see, oh my goodness, Hermes is pretty old. Like originally it was just a like just a pillar, like a stone pillar. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
Hermes.
That
Yeah,
one is very, very ancient.
yeah,
Even before Zeus was worshipped, Herm was worshipped in Greek. So it's pretty old.
yeah,
And if you review uh, the Orphic tradition, they say Hermes was famous. So
mm,
it's a
yeah,
very old. So no matter which culture you go, they attribute, oh, Hermes-like figure was the very first person that we recognize. I'll give you one example. For example, there are some Jewish like mystic in the second century BCE in the Dead Sea Scroll literature based on. So
mm.
their Hermes is Moses himself.
Oh yeah,
they,
yeah,
they always attribute the very first person that they respect is
mm,
equivalent of Hermes. So
yeah,
in Egypt, because all the scribe and the priest, they reference their first authority is the Thoth, not other god, because Thoth was the literature, writing, knowledge, wisdom. He
yeah,
represents measurement, everything. So they
yeah,
attribute their tradition back to Thoth. Then in Greece, they attribute their tradition back to Hermes, like older Hermes.
yeah,
And even in like Abrahamic tradition, either Abraham himself or Moses himself or
yeah,
Zoroaster himself. So everywhere you go, this Hermes figure is the first figure who we recognize as a person who communicated some knowledge. So it's very like, I don't know why they have to be very old. It's like
yeah,
they insist this tradition is very, very old.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it is hard to, well, largely impossible to to really separate clearly between history and mythology here. So it won't. So it, you know, I'm a big fan of the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, who's written fantastic works. And one of the things that I learned from him is to differentiate between history and what he calls mnemal history. On the one hand, history as the attempt to describe what really happened, and on the other hand, mnemal history, which is about things that may never have happened, but that are remembered to have happened. And so Asman's big example is Moses, whom you mentioned. Um, there is no historical evidence that Moses ever happened, ever lived. But Moses is an extremely powerful figure of memory, of cultural memory. And as we all know, so the whole birth of monotheism, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, traces itself back to Moses. So the mnemal history, the history of as we remember it, is extremely important and influential, whether or not it refers
Any
to actual
historical
historical
correlate?
events.
No. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's no historical correlate. It's just a traditional anecdotes or maybe antecedent theoretical. I would say theoretical that if something comes like that, it must be coming from that tradition.
yeah,
Like so, those are Abrahamic, like Jewish, even Christianity. And we covered Greek, and also we covered Egyptian thought, possible thought. But
yeah,
in Islamic tradition, I would add they even went beyond Abraham. In
mm,
Islamic tradition, they're saying that the whatever whoever is the Hermes figure, the teacher is like Prophet Idris, and
oh yeah,
he was descendant from Seth, the
oh yeah,
third child of Abraham. It's all like theoretical because nobody can prove or disprove anything.
yeah,
So they say that this Abrahamic tradition uh, was post-Diluvian, but only Hermes connects the antediluvian wisdom to
mm,
Abrahamic tradition, and
mm,
from there we got it. So
yeah,
they claim is non-broken chain of
yeah,
tradition,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
very
yeah,
ancient.
yeah. Fascinating stories. Very fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, I think let's because if we discuss this, it will never end. So let's move on,
Mhm.
and perhaps we can talk about particularly your focus in in Italian Renaissance figure,
Yeah.
why you start, like how you found Lodovico Razzarelli
Okay, all
in,
right.
in relation to this Hermetic literature.
Okay, well, thank you for asking because I love to tell the story. It's a very nice story. Um, as a background, let me say first of all that yeah, because not all your viewers may know this, but so the Corpus Hermeticum, the most important collection of Hermetic writings, was translated by an Italian humanist, Marsilio Ficino, a very well-known Platonist, the first translator of the complete Platonic literature into Latin, and also, yeah, in many ways, a very important figure. So Ficino is famous, and he in around 1463 was given access to a manuscript, Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, and he was asked by Cosimo de' Medici, the leader of Florence, to translate it. Okay, so he did, and it got published in 1471. And now the thing is that this translation by Ficino, the so-called Pimander, as it was called, made a big impact in the Renaissance on many people. It got published in a whole series of later editions. It got translated. There was a lot of interest in Hermes based upon Ficino's translation. And so, well, the famous English historian Francis Yates then wrote in 1964, she wrote his famous book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, which became a bestseller. It's still a bestseller. And here she tells a kind of grand story about the Hermetic literature in the Renaissance, the Hermetic tradition, as she calls it. And it basically says that Ficino translates the Corpus Hermeticum, then a couple of other famous intellectuals like Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno and others discovered this literature. This became a huge Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance. This survived until the early 17th century, and then finally it declined for all kinds of reasons that doesn't matter here. But this book became incredibly influential, and so it created this picture of the Hermetic tradition with Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and Giordano Bruno, famous intellectuals at the heart of the Hermetic tradition. That was the idea. And when I discovered Lodovico Lazzarelli, that was the narrative. That was the story. Everybody assumed that. And many people still assume that. Now, what happened is that I was living in 1997 in Paris for a year and a half. I spent the time there. So I was living in Paris, and I was very good friends with the main scholar specialist of esotericism at the time, Antoine Fèvre, who was professor of history of esotericism at Sorbonne, at the École Pratique des Hautes Études of the Sorbonne in Paris. And Fèvre was a very good friend of mine. He died a couple of years ago, and he has created this whole field of study basically with his work. So I was a lot in touch with him, and one evening I went to his home in Meudon, and we spent a nice evening together. And at one point he went to the toilet, and I was looking around at his bookcases, similar bookcases like you have there behind you, behind glass. And he had some kind of a section with old antiquarian books. And somehow I picked out a book there, and it turned out to be a 16th century old book, very valuable. He had that, an antiquarian book, by a French author that I'd never heard of. And it was about Hermetica. And something in that book caught my interest. I do not know why, but it's almost like destiny. At that moment, like Hermes was ticking on my shoulder, like, pay attention to this book. So I picked out this book and I asked Antoine, I'd love to read this. And he said, oh, you can borrow it, which is extraordinary. It's a very expensive 16th century volume, but I could take it home. So I took it with me, and then I started reading it in bed at night. The old 16th century French, very difficult. And I found out that part of the text consisted of An author I'd never heard of, Lois Lazarel in French. Lazarel, never heard of the name. The Crater Hermetis, Le Bassin d'Hermes, the Basin of Hermes. Never heard of it, but I tried reading it, and it was fascinating. It resonated somehow. I basically could not understand what I was reading. It was very difficult, but something in it ticked, something that clicked with me. Then a couple of weeks later, I went back to Amsterdam, and I made a visit, as I did more often, to the famous Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica, the so-called Ritman Library, which was the best, most important library of Hermetic literature in the world. It is in Amsterdam. So I went there, and I met, by chance, I met a guy who was sitting there in a corner, who was making translations. I asked, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm translating texts from Latin into English. And so we started talking. His name was Ruud Bouthorn. I didn't know him. And I asked, well, what are you translating? And he said, well, at the moment I'm working on a 15th century Italian thinker, Lodovico Lazzarelli. And then suddenly it clicked in my mind, Lois Lazarel, Lodovico Lazzarelli, same person. What a coincidence. I'd never heard of him. Within 2 weeks, I heard about him twice, and I met this guy. Incredible. So yeah, we started talking. He turned out to be an excellent translator from Neo-Latin, and so we started working together, and we ended up producing this book about Lodovico Lazzarelli. So we translated all the Hermetic texts by Lazzarelli into English. We made critical edition with annotation and English translation, a large introduction. It got published in 2005. And why was this important? It basically, Lazzarelli changed my entire idea about this so-called Hermetic tradition radically. So what was the point? Lazzarelli is an unknown figure. He was a minor humanist poet, not nearly as famous as Ficino. One day, Lazzarelli, well, he is in Rome, in the Holy City. He's in Rome. He goes to the Vatican, and he sees a public preacher, a preacher on the streets, who is preaching to the crowds. And this turns out to be a certain Giovanni da Correggio, who was a kind of charismatic speaker. And they became friends. Correggio made a big impression on Lazzarelli. Lazzarelli became his pupil. Then a few, not so long after that, we have several texts that Lazzarelli has written and offered to his master, to his guru, to Correggio. And one of these texts consists of a translation of the final 3 treatises from the Corpus Hermeticum. The point is this, that Ficino had translated the Corpus Hermeticum, but the text consists of actually 17 treatises. And the manuscript that Ficino was using was incomplete. It had only 14 treatises. Now, Lazzarelli discovered an independent manuscript with the extra treatises and translated them, which means that it's not correct that Ficino was the only one to translate the Corpus Hermeticum. Lazzarelli was the other translator, even though it's a small part, but he's the other translator. He should be mentioned. Okay, he makes beautiful manuscripts, which he offers as a gift to Correggio, consisting of Ficino's translation, his own translation, and of the famous Asclepius that I mentioned earlier, a text in Latin, a Hermetic text in Latin. Okay, then not that much longer, on a Palm Sunday in the 80s, in the 1480s, don't recall now which year, I think 1486, I'm not sure, but I think it's 86. Correggio makes a spectacular appearance in Rome. You know, he comes there, he draws attention to the crowds in all kinds of ways, and he finally dresses up like Jesus Christ. He dresses like Jesus Christ in a white mantle. He has some crown of thorns on his head. He has all kind of symbolic things with him, and he's sitting on a donkey, and he enters a white donkey, and he enters Rome. So he he repeats the story of Jesus who enters Jerusalem, and now he enters Rome in the same way. He attracted a great crowd, and it is clear from his presentation that he believed that he was in a certain way, he impersonated Christ, but he was also impersonating Hermes in some way. So he saw himself as a kind of a Hermetic Christ. Now, very spectacular, and there's a lot that could be said about Correggio because he had a later career, but that would go a bit far maybe now. But Lazzarelli was incredibly impressed by him. He saw him as the figure who united the Christian message with the Hermetic message. So that was for him, that was the core of what it was all about. A couple of years later, he writes a very impressive text, the Crater Hermetis, which he tries to offer to the king of Naples, Ferrante, a famous king, very influential guy. And this text is very important, and that's one of the texts that we published. And this is a new Hermetic dialogue, newly written by Lazzarelli, but very strongly modeled on the original Hermetic literature, in which Lazzarelli takes the role of the teacher of Hermes Trismegistus, and he's teaching two pupils, Ferrante, the king, and his secretary and first minister, Giovanni Pontano. So two pupils, one master. They ask all kinds of questions, and there's a very lively dialogue between the two, and it's very impressive. Lazzarelli was a very gifted writer. He writes beautiful Latin. It's poetic. There are a couple of poems also in it. And he develops a very distinctive new understanding of the Hermetica, which is factually incorrect, but extremely impressive and creative and fascinating. So what he basically says, and now I'm combining what we know about Lazzarelli and the Crater Hermetis, so I'm basically collapsing some things in one shorter story here. But basically what Lazzarelli believed was very spectacular. He said that Correggio was Jesus Christ, who had come back to earth in the shape of Hermes. And the story behind this goes back to the Hermetic literature itself, because if you read the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, the so-called Poimandres, it is the account of a visionary encounter between Hermes and Poimandres. Now, Poimandres is a manifestation of God himself, who appears in a vision to Hermes. And he is the divine light himself. He's basically a representation of God. And so that's Poimandres. And now Lazzarelli is referring to this well-known text, and he is saying, well, what actually happens there? And this is a creative new idea by Lazzarelli that nobody had ever said before. But Lazzarelli says, well, Hermes was encountering Poimandres, and Poimandres was basically the Son of God. And the Son of God is no one else than the Logos. In the Greek New Testament, the Logos is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So in other words, Poimandres, this figure who appears to a pagan sage, to Hermes, is actually no one else than Christ. And so the story that Lazzarelli then creates is that Christ himself first appeared to a pagan wise man, to Hermes, and Hermes partly understood him and partly misunderstood him because he was a pagan and he was not entirely enlightened. Then later the Logos, the Son of God, is incarnated as Jesus Christ, and that for Lazzarelli, of course, that's the beginning of Christianity, which he believes in very strongly. And now the third stage has come. So now Correggio has appeared, and Correggio brings the two traditions together. He brings the Hermetic tradition of Poimandres together with Christianity. And this means that this will, for Lazzarelli, be the beginning of the renovation of true Christianity. So he believes that we are now embarking on a new phase in the history of Christianity, which will be based on the fusion and the integration of pagan Hermetic wisdom and Christian wisdom, and that will be the future of Christianity. So that's what he believes. Now, of course, none of this has happened, but it's an extremely creative, original, fascinating idea, and the text is really a gem. I think it's one of the most impressive small Hermetic texts that have been written. Lazzarelli was a brilliant mind. And so, yeah, and why is this important to me? It completely, and then I come back to the grand narratives of Francis Yates. It basically completely undermines Francis Yates' narrative, because she said it was all about the great individuals like Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno. Now, actually, I come to the conclusion that none of these people were really Hermetic thinkers. Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum, but he was much more interested in Platonism, and he basically disregarded the Hermetic literature very quickly. For him, it was Plato, not Hermes. Pico della Mirandola was very interested in many things, but mostly in the Jewish Kabbalah, the secret wisdom of the Jews, but not really in the Hermetica. He knew them. It was not important to him, not very much. Giordano Bruno knew about the Hermetica, but it's not central to his work. So if you're looking for a real Hermetic figure, a real Hermetist in the 15th century, it's not Ficino, it's not Pico, it's not Giordano Bruno, it is Lazzarelli. He is the real example of a Christian Hermetist. So why did Francis Yates marginalize him in her story? Simply because he was a small fish. He was far too small. Ficino, Pico, Bruno were famous names, so you could hang your hat on them. You could tell a great story about their Hermetic tradition, very influential, very impressive. But the story was false. Because the true story of the Hermetica is that a minor figure like Lazzarelli wrote a fantastic text, very influential, not very influential, but very impressive. And there is a small and kind of discreet Hermetic tradition that continues after Lazzarelli to Cornelius Agrippa, the author on magic in the 16th century, and a few other names might be mentioned. And the final thing here is that Francis Yates wrote his bestseller in which he said Hermetica is all about magic. And magic for her was at the origin of the scientific revolution. So the Hermetic magic paved the way for modern science. That was her big story. But Lazzarelli, the true Hermetist, was not interested in magic, almost not. He had nothing with science, was not his concern. He was interested in a spiritual, individual Christian message. But that message simply did not fit Francis Yates' narrative. It's not what she wanted to hear. It's not what she was interested in. It didn't fit her agenda. And so she pushed Lazzarelli away in some footnotes. And then so the real Hermetist was pushed off the stage, as I put it. And other people who are not Hermetists were put on the stage, even though they didn't belong there. So
Yeah,
it's
it's a
my long
fascinating,
story to a short answer.
yeah, it's a fascinating long list of literature, and everybody has their own biases,
Yes.
including religious or ideologic biases. For
Yeah.
example, the way you describe, I like to summarize. So, Poimander, I think, translates commonly into shepherd of men.
Yeah, that's not actually true. That is
So,
often said, but if I may interrupt for a moment, that has to do with it has often been associated with a text, the Shepherd of Hermes. How does that? Yeah. But that hypothesis has been discarded nowadays. So the name Poimandres really comes from Egyptian, from I'm not sure whether I have it available exactly, but it is an Egyptian etymology, and it has nothing to do with the Shepherd of Hermes.
Okay.
But many scholars have believed that for a very long time.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Even Wikipedia says that possible etymologic derivation is the like shepherd of men, like guide of men. But anyway, it's a very like the my common sense understanding is because this literature is very confusing and no, like most of the people even recognize why this literature is important anyway. They will not even recognize that why this particular literature is important. And plus, as you mentioned, the important literature of Ficino versus Pico della Mirandola, they're diverting this particular literature in their own direction and biases.
Yeah.
But out of all these noises, you are pretty confident that Lazzarelli represents the real Hermetic tradition and he understood it by like confirmed. You are very confirmed. So
Oh yeah, much more than Ficino. Ficino didn't understand it very well, but Lazzarelli actually understood it very deeply. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So I would say by using this analogy, I would say something very bold that might surprise you. I would say somebody who understands this core Hermetic literature, he himself is part of the body of Hermes himself because it
Okay.
is hermetically sealed. Without the under, if you are pretty sure that you understood the literature correctly and you can bet your life on it, that indirectly gives you are not the now the part of the body of Hermes himself.
Mm.
So so that's why I like because Lazzarelli recognized the Giovanni di Correggio himself is the Hermes 2.0
Yeah,
in the guise of Jesus. And
yes.
because you understood it also out of
Mhm.
all this noise, that gives me a profound respect to you because whoever understands this core thesis, they saw the vision directly or indirectly. So thank you for the literature, especially the Crater Hermetis. I read it multiple times. Thanks
Mm.
for English translation because this is
Oh, thank
original
you very much.
Latin.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I actually converted it as my personal audiobook. So when I
Oh,
drive,
really?
I can
Ah,
listen to it. So
ah,
it's nice because
fantastic.
it's
Fantastic.
lovely, lovely. It's roughly 1.5 hour, and the voice is so nice and clear. It's like all like a drama, like
Ah,
Lazzarelli talking to Frederick, and Frederick is talking with Pontano, and their conversation is very nice, actually,
yeah,
very
yeah.
entertaining, very
This
entertaining.
is, let me say, how much I like to hear this. This is really fantastic. This warms my heart to hear this, that have been reading it multiple times or even listening to it on an, yeah, that is very, very nice. You know, when as a scholar, we are, people like me, we are spending a lot of time behind our computer, hoping that some people will pick up my stuff. So to hear that you have been reading and listening even to it, that's really, really nice. So I know that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't been wasting my time. Yeah.
So I'll send you a copy of the audiobook, MP3
Oh,
file.
fantastic.
It's very easy to like you can listen to your phone or you
Yeah.
can connect to your car when you're driving. I think if you
Fantastic.
listen, even though you translated yourself,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure if you listen, it will come alive again. So it's very
Oh,
nice to listen.
wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Uh,
Thank you very much. Right. Yeah.
So in the Crater Hermetis, I think they reference the mixing bowl of Hermes, like Crater.
Yeah.
So they discuss that how to attain happiness in life. That was
Mm.
the very beginning of conversation because he was suggesting that now King Frederick, you have served your like country and now you are retired. Now you
Yeah.
have luxury of time, so why not? Because I love you and I'm here to give you this wisdom to you. Let's talk about it, how to attain happiness in life. So why
Yeah.
not go through the main points of the crater, if you want to.
Very at the beginning, they talk about this ancient Egyptian wisdom, and it's interesting that Lazzarelli really, usually most people in this period would emphasize Plato, but he hardly talks about Plato. It's all about Hermes. And of course, when he mentions Hermes, then the king and Pontano say, oh, you're speaking so highly about Hermes Trismegistus, this pagan sage. It almost looks like you are an Hermetist. Aren't you a Christian? And then Lazzarelli says, no, I am a Christian, but I'm not ashamed to call myself a Hermetist as well. So that's where they start. So at making this point. But then they end up getting into a whole series of biblical exegesis. So they go through several parts of the Bible, which Lazzarelli reads through his own Hermetic lens, and he finds deeper wisdom in the Hermetic texts, and they discuss the real meaning of those biblical texts for a very long time. So a large part is about that. Yes, what can I say? So the dialogue goes through a whole series of phases, but basically at one point they end up, well, getting closer and closer to their real topic. And the real topic is about how to find true felicity, true happiness. And then it's basically, and I'll try to find the right.
Fontano and Frederick was arguing that you are talking about finding true happiness, but the happiness comes from knowing God. Are you suggesting you can know God? Because based on our scripture, nobody can know God. So then he started talking that how using Hermetic literature, you can still know God. So that's very nice flow of argumentation.
Yes.
Somebody suggesting something that our scripture says based on these verses that nobody can know God except Son of God and the Son of God who gives you the wisdom to somebody else. And you're suggesting we go know God by ourselves. It's not possible. Then he says, no, based on our own literature, like for example, Moses was talking about tree of life versus tree of knowledge of good and evil. This tree of life is the Hermetic tradition. You contemplate about divine things and image of God. But if you contemplate about good and bad, then some materialistic thing, you will be mixing into the mixing ball and you lost into corruption. So he was using this Abrahamic tradition to say that Hermes was not saying something different. And by using this Hermetic wisdom, you can still know God without violating your scripture itself. Because scripture also suggests you can still know God.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? You're just summarizing it very well. What I found very fascinating is how it's finally, towards the end of the dialogue, how it develops, because you get through all these discussions. It would be impossible to summarize it here, but at one point there is this hymn of regeneration, the hymn of rebirth. And that's, I think, then we get to the core of what the text is all about. Because
just one thing, I think before you start the hymn part, how the regeneration works, I think at the very top of the book, he had a monologue. Lazzarelli had a monologue that how he was lost and he was saved by Hermes, and now you feel regenerated, and he wants to talk about it. So the very first theme of this crater was his personal experience of regeneration, and he tried to teach these to Frederick and Pontano, and the very last part, it ended up with the hymn that you are just going to say.
That's right. Yeah. And he says that he himself has been reborn. He does not mention Correggio anywhere here, but it's clear that Correggio is in the background. And he says that he himself has been reborn as a son of God. And he's now going to teach his pupils how that works. And yeah, and then they end up with this hymn towards the end of the dialogue, and it's beautiful how it is done. And there are 3 verses which I could read, which are really go to the core of what's happening here. And it goes as follows, and I'll explain later then what it means, what's happening. So he says, this is certainly the newest novelty of novelties, and a miracle far greater than all others, that man has discovered the nature of God and knows how to make it. For just as God, or just as the Lord or God the begetter, generates the celestials and procreates the angels, who are the forms of things, the heads and the first exemplars of all, just so the true man creates divine souls, which the ancient host used to call gods of the earth, who are glad to live close to humans and rejoice at the welfare of man. Now, this is what you read here, and I think at first sight, I think most people, most of your viewers, when they hear this, they will probably find it hard to make anything out of this, right? Now, so you have to really look into this closely, what he's saying here. The first thing to notice is that he is actually paraphrasing a part of the Asclepius, that's Hermetic text. And that's actually, this is a paraphrase of that text. Now, in that text, we find a very famous, perhaps the most famous part of the entire Hermetic literature. It became famous because the church father Augustine condemned it. And so, yeah, this stuck to the name of Hermes ever since, so to speak. And what was this about? In the Asclepius, Hermes at one point talks in very admiring, positive terms about the ancient Egyptian practice of animating statues. So you have the statues of the gods in the temple, and he says that the ancient Egyptians learned the secret of how to make gods, how to create gods. That means basically, create animated and sold statues in the temples, in the Egyptian temples. And Hermes writes about this in very positive terms. Okay, now then, Augustine, the church father, wrote about this in De Civitate Dei, on the City of God. It's one of his most important works. He spent quite some pages talking about this, and he condemned Hermes Trismegistus as an idolater, because that is the very definition of idolatry, namely that a man-made statue, which just consists of material, of matter, is being venerated as a deity, and that a deity is supposed to reside in the statue. That is what the pagans are doing, and that is condemned by the first 2 of the 10 commandments, because there can only be one God, and you cannot have carved images. That is an absolute horror in the eyes of God. That is so basic to the Jewish and the Christian and the Islamic tradition that this is not acceptable. So Augustine pointed out, well, Hermes is very enthusiastic about statue animation. This proves that Hermes was an idolater and a false teacher that cannot be trusted. So, and that became the story throughout the Middle Ages until Ficino and Lazzarelli. Now, the interesting thing is that Lazzarelli, when it comes to the heart of the mystery that he wants to tell, he picks out exactly this passage. He could have picked some kind of safe passage from the Hermetic literature. No, he goes to the most dangerous, the most controversial part of everything, exactly this part. And he paraphrases it in these verses, because he says this is the novelty of novelties, his own message, the novelty of novelties, a miracle far greater than all others, that man has discovered the nature of God and knows how to make it. Now, in Hermes, this was making gods, making statues. But here it means something else with Hermes. And then he talks about generation and procreation and bringing forth, etc. And well, basically what he is saying here is that what he calls true human beings, human beings who have discovered their own true divine essence, will be able to unite themselves with God himself. Now, this in itself is very controversial in basic Jewish, Christian, and Islamic context, because human beings are supposed to be creatures by God, but that you can become one with God transgresses the boundary between creature and creator. So it's very controversial and problematic, and maybe dangerous to say this, but that is what he says. He says we can actually be reborn, go through an interior rebirth, and then we are reborn as sons of God and basically as parts of God himself. So we become divine, and this is the doctrine of deification or divinization. We can become gods ourselves or become divine ourselves. And what this means is that, and that is what he is basically saying here, that if we go through this rebirth, and then this means that we come to participate in the very essence of God himself. And what is the essence of God himself? Well, he is the creator. God's ability to create souls is the essence of God's creative power. And so we participate in that same power, and that means that human beings will be able to do what God did. We will participate in his own creative abilities. That means that human beings who have been reborn are able to create souls themselves by using God's own creative powers. Now that's what he says, and he says, basically he suggests in context that Mandries appear to Hermes. Hermes didn't really get the message yet because he was a pagan. He lived before Christ. And so he lapsed into idolatry in this text. He believed that it was all about drawing down gods into statues and making God statues in this manner. And that was a mistake. And so Hermes actually lapsed into idolatry. So Augustine had been right in condemning Hermes. However, Hermes had not gotten the true message, and the true message from Poimandres was now made available again through Correggio and through Lazzarelli. And the true message is, it's not about making statues. No, it's about making gods. It's not about making statues, it's about making souls. And making souls means the ability to make souls is equivalent to having become one with God, because then you can do that. And so the message that Hermes misunderstood has to be reinterpreted, and this time it has to be understood the right way. That is what Correggio is teaching, that is what Lazzarelli is teaching. And what is the message? The message is that we can be reborn, and in a radical manner, from fallen human creatures who are subject to the curse of the fall after Adam and Eve ate the apple in paradise. That curse can be lifted from us, because when we get reborn as sons of God, then we reverse the effects of the fall, and we regain the powers that Adam and Eve had before the fall, and we become one with God, and we become like gods on earth, basically. And when we do that, then we have found the true source of happiness and felicity.
Exactly.
Because the only felicity lies in being one with God himself. Yeah.
Exactly. So what he started with in the Crater Hermetis, that how to become happy at the end of your life after you do your homework. That means you do your job, you perform your duties, and after doing all the good things, how to become happy. So Lazzarelli's prescription, based on the Hermetic tradition, is just borning again by having a second birth. But this particular rebirth, if you compare with the contemporary and the ancient across culture. This is not a strange thing. This is a common thing, I would say. So let's talk about it, for example.
Ah,
So, for example, the enlightenment idea of this Hindu tradition or Vedantic tradition, enlightenment.
yeah.
You understand the world in a different way, and the moment you understand, that becomes your new identity. So
Mm,
that's the rebirth.
mm,
So the Lazzarelli is prescribing the same thing. The
mm.
understanding the world makes you a new person, and you recognize your old self was not the same person that you are today.
Yeah.
So that's the spiritual rebirth. And now, if you yourself made a rebirth, now you're talking with a second person like Pontano and Frederick, and you are helping them to recognize that you recognize, so that they can born again. So that's the he's making a soul out of the Frederick and Pontano. So he
Yeah.
is making new soul because he have the power now, because
Yeah.
he already had that experience before.
Yeah.
So now if you talk about Sufi tradition in Islam, it's
Mhm.
all about union with God. Their
Mm.
main goal is the union with God. It's not exotic idea.
Yeah.
And even in Jesus Christ, I would say that after John the Baptist baptized him, after that his ministry started. So he born again with the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
whatever his identity was before, he assumed a new identity and started his ministry.
Yeah.
So here, John the Baptist serves as a purpose of Hermes, and he made a new Hermes, the perfect Hermes, the Christ himself. So this tradition is not exotic, and I'll tell you a legend, like Islamic legend. In Islam, I think it borrows from Jewish tradition also, that God first made a statue of Adam with a clay, and that was lifeless for a long time.
Mm.
Then he discussed whether to make this statue alive or not with angels. And
Mm.
angel says, no, if you create man, they will create destruction. They will not listen to you. They will not worship you. This is a
Mm.
waste of time. You already created us. We are praising you. Why you bother to create a human? Then God says, I know something that you don't know. And he animated the body of Adam by pushing the breath of life through the nostril. So what
Mhm.
he did, he just animated a statue.
Yeah.
God himself did it at the very beginning.
Mm.
So this is not something exotic.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. The way you describe this is wonderful. This is really, really, really good. Yeah. I love
So,
that.
so,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so Lazarelli is not like going out of tradition. He's just clarifying the confusion of people had about this idea of how to make a new soul.
Yeah.
You understand yourself first, and you help other people to understand. By making them understand, you create a new soul,
Yeah.
and that soul is the divine soul because that's the image of God
Yeah.
that you've
Yeah. Yeah.
forgotten.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
This
So,
is
and I
very
think you're
powerful
right.
literature.
No, I think you're totally right. I mean, yeah, rebirth is a much more central topic than people realize. Of course, you have people in America talking about the born again Christians and so on, but rebirth is such a fundamental idea. As you say, in Jewish and Christian, in Islamic traditions, and also in the Hermetica, absolutely, absolutely. And maybe if you allow me to say something also about how it appears in the original Hermetic literature. Is that okay if I say something about it?
Yeah. I have plenty of time. It's all yours.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, because I wrote this book about Hermetic spirituality a couple of years ago, and so well, I discovered how central the idea of rebirth is there. But in the Hermetica, it does not mean exactly what Lazzarelli means. It is different, but it's both about rebirth. So here, in Hermetica, it's a different story, especially in Corpus Hermeticum 13, but in other parts as well. So the basic story is this. when we usually get born in our first birth, that means that the soul comes from the heavenly spheres. It travels through the several levels of the heavens, through the planetary spheres. It goes down from one planet to another, Saturn, etc. As it goes down, it acquires subtle material bodies and so on. And finally, the soul ends up in the womb, and it stays there for 9 months, and then it gets born as a human body, as a human being. Okay, this is well known. That is the first birth. That is what birth means. However, and that's fascinating, what Hermetica say is that the moment that this happens, the soul enters the womb. And no, not the moment this happens, the moment the soul comes out of the womb. So the moment that you get born. At that very moment, it means that a double entity enters the world. A double entity because human beings consist of partly of a divine soul and partly of a material body. So that's the double entity of the human being. That gets born. The moment this happens, the daimonic entities, the kind of astral energies that are connected to the heavenly bodies, pay attention to the appearance of this newborn child in the world, because it didn't appear yet, and now it appears. And I use a kind of an analogy, just imagine, think of this like a radar screen, like so the astral powers, the daimones, the daimonic entities that resides over the heavenly spheres, they are watching Earth. They see all these blips on the radar that are moving around. That's us, human beings, are moving around in this radar under this. We are falling in the radar, and then suddenly a newborn child appears. So there's a new blip on the radar. So it appears. Suddenly it's there. At that very moment, the daimonic entities come down and they invade the body of the newborn child. So they take possession of us. And this happens to all of us. It happens to you, it happens to me, to everybody. So we get possessed, literally, by daimonic entities that start residing in our soul and in our body, and they stay here. And according to the Hermetica, this is why we have a complex emotional personality. So some people are easily angered, probably because they have a strong daimon from the planet Mars, which is all about anger and violence and so on. Other people are very soft and friendly and full of love, and there's maybe a lot of Venus in their entity, and so on and so forth. And you have all these mixtures. So our personality does not actually come from our soul. Our personality comes from the astral entities that are in our soul and our body. And
This
yeah.
is the mixing bowl that has both reason, daimonic entity, and surprisingly, the mind also.
Well, that's an interesting suggestion. I haven't thought of that idea, that the crater could be interpreted in this way. That's possible.
Is the mixing bowl. And I think in Hermetica 4, there is a separate section, and that section is fascinating because when I read your book, the Lazarelli gave the title of the work Crater. Then I realized why he's naming this as a crater. It's a mixing bowl. So mixing bowl literature. So that's a very short section.
I know. Yeah.
And that one says that when human being comes in the lower world, it has a mixture of a lot of different things. And if you don't pay attention, you'll miss the mind part. The mind part comes from Poimander himself.
Yeah.
And the other part comes from the daimonic and the passion and sensation and our own desires.
Yeah,
But
and these daimonic entities come from the cosmos. So they're cosmic. They come from our material world.
Yes.
And it's true. In Corpus Hermeticum 4, it says that God sent down this mixing bowl into the world, a mixing bowl full of nous.
Yes.
And the Greek word nous is being used, which is basically the divine light. And so he sent that down, and I'm going to follow up on your suggestion whether the mixing bowl could be seen as standing for our combined human entity. It's a very interesting suggestion.
Because
But
because because Lazzarelli discussed this mixing bowl idea in
yeah,
context of Pandora's jar
yeah,
in the crater. So in the Pandora jar, he was saying that Hermes, uh, as a punishment, because Zeus commanded there has to be a punishment for the man,
yeah,
and Hermes created this Pandora's jar that is full of all passion, sensation, taste, emotion, happiness, but there is a expectancy. That is the monadal part that remains at the bottom. It
yeah,
never leaves, but the problem is because all the passion, sensation roams around outside, they don't recognize the image of God that hangs on the neck of the jar.
mm,
So the human body itself, even though it has the monad or light or the Poimander's mind or divine mind or light,
yeah,
because we also has this daimonic cosmic part. For example, each planet gives some attributes to the nature of the things.
yeah,
That each person we meet gives an identity by reflecting their idea on us. So we
yeah,
become a new person at birth, not knowing our monadal part. And
yeah,
now we're lost with the passion and fail to recognize. But the bottom line is, when I read your work and the mixing ball, I realized, oh, mixing ball is the human body. We
yeah.
are bombarded with everything, missing the point. And Lazzarelli was suggesting that if you recognize the light within, that is your salvation for rebirth. There's no
Yeah.
other way around.
It's a very powerful interpretation, and I think this, yeah, you could very well be right that this is actually so. What it means in the Hermetica itself, and then what Lazzarelli does with it, there are two different things. But it's a very interesting way of looking at it. It certainly makes sense. Yeah. So just to finish my story. So this is what happens. So we get inhabited by those diamonds, and all of us are walking around like that, and this is why we behave the way we behave in all kinds of bad ways, because we have forgotten our true the light, the noetic light in our heart, basically. We've forgotten it, and we get overwhelmed by the emotional passions that have to do with the cosmic forces, the cosmic energies. So that's the analysis of why things are going so badly in the world. This is why we behave so badly, because we are under the influence of diamonds, and we cannot separate them from our true essence. So, and then in Corpus Hermeticum 13, you have this treatise about the rebirth. And so it's a wonderful text. So you read there how the pupil Thoth meets Hermes Trismegistus. He has been doing all kinds of spiritual exercises and whatever. And he wants to have gnosis now. He wants to have salvational insight. And then Hermes is a bit hesitant, and he gives some evasive, strange answers, which Thoth doesn't understand. But the conversation develops, and at one point, Thoth realizes that he enters into a strange, unusual state of consciousness, an altered state of consciousness called mania in Greek, divine madness. Doesn't mean he's insane, it doesn't mean he's mad, but it means that he's in a strange, unusual state of consciousness, mania. And that means that he is on his way to being reborn. So then you get through the text, and at one point, Hermes basically tells Thoth, okay, right, you're on the point of being reborn. So this means that you are still not able to see the true light of divinity at this moment. And the reason is that this is because you have those tormentors inside you. You use the word tormentors or torments. And this is just a reference to these astral entities or these daimonic entities in his body. well, Thoth is surprised. He said, do I have tormentors in myself? He said, yeah. Hermes says, yes, 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 you do. But we're going to drive them out. And I imagine, this is not described, but this is my interpretation, and I think there are good reasons to assume this, is that what we get then is a description of an exorcism ritual in which the tormentors are going to be driven out of Thoth's body. So what happens is that Hermes invokes 10 powers of light. There are 10 powers because there are 10 levels in the Hermetic universe. You have the 7 levels of the cosmos, the 7 planetary spheres. Then you have the 8th level of life, the souls, living souls. Then you have the 9th level of light, which is the noetic light of divinity. And you have the 10th level, which is also the first level, which is the source, the pagan in Greek, the ultimate source, the divine source from which everything is continuously being born. So you have again this metaphor of birth, this image of birth. The universe is born, we are born, everything is born from the pagan, from God. Okay, so you have 10 levels. So Hermes then invokes 10 powers of light into the body of Thoth. And these powers of light enter his body and they drive out the dark daimonic powers of the astral energies out of his body. And there are 12 of them. Well, 12 because the 12th side of the zodiac. So it makes sense. 10 powers drive out 12 powers. 12 dark powers leave his body with a flapping of wings, we read literally. So really like entities leave his body. And that is the moment of rebirth, because at that moment, the 10 powers of light weave themselves into a spiritual body of light in the physical body of Thoth. So he still has his physical body, the product of the first birth, but now it is inhabited by a second body, a body of light, which is born. And this is a literal physical, spiritual birth of light in the body. And this is divine light. So this is the rebirth. And the moment that this happens, Thoth is no longer seeing the world by his normal physical senses, because normally we see the world in time and space. So I am focused on this space where I'm sitting at this moment in time. But the moment that Thoth is reborn, he's no longer bound to space and time. And so you get this wonderful description in which he says, I'm everywhere. I am in the past, I'm in the future, I'm in the present, I am here in this place, I'm in India on the other side of the world, I'm in the ocean, I'm in the air, I'm everywhere. And so the rebirth does not just mean that that this light body is taking shape into your physical body. It also means that your consciousness is radically changed and becomes able to see the world in the same way that God himself sees the world, namely everything at the same time and all times at the same time. And so this is the description, Corpus Hermeticum 13. So that's the rebirth. That's not a Christian interpretation of Lazzarelli. It's a different model, but still about rebirth.
Exactly. The rebirth idea is so central. I think like Thoth's experience after recognizing the rebirth, that he's everywhere. Like this idea, I think the very first encounter when Hermes was in the state of half asleep and he encountered Poimander at the very first moment. So his introduction was, I am Poimander and I am with you everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And this decade is Henad, is the same thing. The moment you recognize this, decade is the 10th layer, and the Henad is the beginning, the root, number one. The
Yes,
10
yes.
and the 1 is the same thing. That triggers the rebirth experience. The moment you recognize, it's not the different, it's the same thing. And that's the beginning of the Hermetic corpus literature. And that's the also the literature that concludes Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis. At the very end, the participant, they're eager to know, okay, tell us how the rebirth works. And I would also say the important part is as a scientist myself. So whenever you try to understand a complex object or complex piece, I would say the most guaranteed way to understand something if you can make it by yourself.
Mm,
Suppose I have this glass in
mm,
front of me.
mm,
I have to understand. So I can measure it, I can do all kinds of things, but the guaranteed way that I'll understand this glass completely if I
mm,
make this glass by myself.
mm,
For example, I found the raw glass, I melted it, I impressed it, then I made the handle. The bottom
mm.
line is the only guaranteed way to understand something completely is to rebuild it, make it by yourself.
I
So
think, well, I really want to thank you for that observation because I think that's, honestly, I think that's a brilliant observation. I think it's absolutely right. It is
And,
right.
and, and Lazzarelli was going step by step by step to rebuild how the human body works by this
Mm,
that passion, this daimonic entity,
mm,
mixing all, how to get rid of those passion by 10th power. And by
mm.
the time you reach 10th power, you recognize you came back at the beginning. So
Yeah,
that's the making of the human body. And actually, that's the magic.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
why
yeah,
people traditionally blame this hermetist as a magician because they change people.
yeah,
They
yeah.
change people.
It changed people. I
Yeah.
think that, yeah. I think you're absolutely bullseye. Absolutely true. This is how it is. And yeah. And like you say, the only if you can make something do you really know it. That's a fantastic observation. That's a fantastic observation. I think that's something that you can apply also to people like Zosimos, the alchemist, who was trying to understand matter by working in it in a laboratory, by making things. Then you get to know them. And yes. That's wonderful. That's really, yeah.
Yeah, I personally want to thank you for this rich because most of the Hermetic literature is lost or not encouraged or nobody reads them because those are in ancient language. But you translated in a very easily readable language, in English language, this Crater Hermetis and Lazavera and Lazzarelli and other people's translation. And
Yeah.
I think that helped me to read and appreciate the work. And that's
Well,
wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
well, thank you very much. And really, it's wonderful to have such an attentive reader of my work, and that's really I appreciate it.
You never know who will read your book. That's why
Exactly.
there is a saying, there was an argument. Let's conclude our discussion today. I think I mentioned in my email that the Thoth and Amun was discussing that you cannot teach people wisdom by writing because the meaning is lost.
Mm,
Amun was saying that meaning is lost. You cannot, but you argue, no. By writing, you can also teach them because that's the alchemy. You
mm,
wrote a book, I understood it.
mm,
So that's the
mm.
alchemy. And it's possible. Yes.
Well, this is very nice to hear. Very nice to hear because that's exactly what I said on the very final pages of this book I wrote about the Hermetica. That yes, how is it possible? The experience cannot be transmitted through language because you have to experience it yourself. But by reading, texts are able to texts have agency and they can do something with you, and you are able to uh, to reconstruct the meaning yourself based upon those texts.
Reassemble the fragmented part and
Yes,
it
yes,
reassembles into an entity, an
yes,
idea. And if when you see what you mean by reading the book, you actually see the writer's point of view and experience yourself. So
Yeah.
it's a teleportation, kind of teleportation, that you
Yeah.
do something here, but it reassembles here. So it's kind
Yeah.
of magic. It's again kind of
Yeah.
magic. So even Amun, God Amun suggesting to Thoth that you cannot teach wisdom by writing a book because the meaning is lost and people will translate it differently. But Thoth was persistent. No, 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 you can still do it. And I respect you that you insisted that no, I think by writing a book and communicating to a third person, that person will like sow the seed and make his own understanding what I am understanding in an identical way. And
Yeah. And
if somebody misunderstood, that's their problem. But if
yes.
somebody understands correctly what I mean, actually, that's a valid way of doing this hermetic magic also.
Yeah, and here we come to a very nice, I think, a natural ending to our conversation, because this act of understanding, as you say, yeah, that is what we call hermeneutics, right? Hermeneutics, and the word hermeneutics basically means the art of understanding texts, but understanding everything. The art of understanding, we call it hermeneutics. And the very word hermeneutics, of course, is derived from Hermes. So that is exactly the hermetic art of understanding things. So in a way, this brings everything together again in the act of understanding, the human act of understanding, which means that you bridge a gap that cannot be bridged. And that is what Hermes does. Bridging
Exactly.
gaps that cannot be bridged.
Thank you so much. And thank you for helping other people to bridge their gaps by your work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this conversation. I enjoyed it very much and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.